Sophia sat alone in her small, sunlit apartment, surrounded by the quiet hum of the world outside. On the surface, she seemed like anyone else, hardworking, thoughtful, and content in her own company. But beneath her composed exterior, she carried a burden she rarely spoke about, a wound buried deep within her heart. For years, Sophia had lived with the lingering ache of an unresolved relationship with her father, a conflict that had shaped the course of her life. It wasn't just the estrangement that weighed on her. It was the silence, the unanswered questions, and the countless nights spent wondering if things could have been different. She remembered their last conversation vividly. The harsh words exchanged, the anger that boiled over, and the door that slammed shut, both literally and figuratively. Time had passed, and the world around her moved forward. But Sophia felt trapped in that moment, unable to let go or make peace with what had been. Each time she thought about reaching out, fear held her back. Fear of rejection, of stirring up old wounds, and of confronting the truth of what had happened. It was easier to bury the pain and keep moving, or so she told herself. But deep down, Sophia longed for closure, for a chance to heal the invisible scars that tied her to the past. Little did she know, an unexpected event was about to change everything, forcing her to face the very feelings she had avoided for so long. Sophia's family had once been her greatest source of joy. Her father, David, was a hard-working man with a sharp wit and an unshakable sense of discipline. He believed in structure, hard work, and living by principles, values he had hoped to pass on to his daughter. Sophia, however, was spirited and free-thinking, often challenging the very ideals her father cherished. Their differences were manageable in her early years, but as Sophia grew older, the cracks began to show. Arguments became frequent, fueled by misunderstandings and the widening gap between their worldviews. David wanted stability and tradition, while Sophia yearned for independence and the chance to carve her own path. The tipping point came during her college years. Sophia had chosen to pursue a career in the arts, a decision David vehemently opposed. He saw it as impractical, a far cry from the secure career he had envisioned for her. Their disagreements escalated into fiery confrontations, with each of them refusing to yield. In their final argument, hurtful words were exchanged, leaving a rift too wide to bridge. Sophia moved out shortly after, determined to prove she could thrive without her father's approval. Meanwhile, David, too proud to reach out, buried himself in his work, masking his pain with a stoic exterior. For years, they lived separate lives, each carrying the weight of unresolved conflict. The family gatherings that once brought warmth now felt hollow without Sophia's presence. Her mother tried to mediate, but the divide seemed insurmountable. Both father and daughter believed time would heal the wounds, but instead, it only deepened their silence. As the years passed, Sophia built a life of her own, achieving the independence she had fought for. Yet, in quiet moments, memories of her father would resurface. The laughter they once shared, the lessons he taught her, and the love that lingered beneath the hurt. She missed him, but pride and fear kept her from reaching out. Unknown to her, David felt the same. Behind his stern exterior was a father who longed to reconnect with his daughter, but didn't know how to bridge the gap. They were two hearts bound by love but separated by pain, waiting for the other to take the first step. Sophia's life had settled into a predictable routine. Mornings were spent in her small studio, painting and losing herself in vibrant colors, while evenings were reserved for quiet reflection or occasional meetups with friends. It was a peaceful existence, though an unspoken void lingered in the background. One chilly autumn afternoon, as golden leaves danced in the wind outside her apartment, Sophia heard a knock at the door. She wasn't expecting anyone and hesitated before answering. When she opened the door, her breath caught. A middle-aged man in a weathered coat stood before her, holding an envelope. "Are you Sophia?" he asked, his voice warm but unfamiliar. She nodded cautiously. The man handed her the envelope, explaining it had been entrusted to him to deliver. Without waiting for an invitation, he tipped his hat and walked away, leaving Sophia alone with her curiosity. The envelope was plain, unmarked except for her name written in a familiar hand. Her heart skipped as she stared at it, the handwriting instantly recognizable. Her father's. She hadn't seen or heard from him in years. Questions swirled in her mind. Why now? Why this way? With trembling hands, she sat on the couch and opened the envelope. Inside was a letter written on lined paper, its edges slightly worn. The sight of her father's handwriting brought a rush of emotions, pain, anger, longing, all colliding at once. The first line read, "Dear Sophia, there are words I should have said long ago, but I didn't know how." Her eyes filled with tears as she read on. The letter was a heartfelt apology, raw and unfiltered. Her father admitted his mistakes, his stubbornness, and his regrets for the years they had lost. He spoke of the love he had always felt for her, even when they were apart, and his pride in the life she had built. The final line read, "I don't know if you can forgive me, but if there's still a place in your heart for me, I would like to try again." Sophia sat in stunned silence, the letter trembling in her hands. The man she had viewed as unyielding and distant had bared his soul on these pages. The years of estrangement, the pain of their last fight, seemed to melt away as she felt the sincerity in his words. For the first time in years, Sophia felt the walls around her heart begin to crack. The letter, so unexpected, carried not just her father's words, but a chance for healing she hadn't dared to hope for. Sophia held the letter in her hands, its weight feeling far heavier than the paper it was written on. Her father's words were raw and honest, peeling back layers of emotions she hadn't allowed herself to confront in years. "My dearest Sophia," it began, a salutation she hadn't heard since she was a child. The letter detailed his life in the years since they had last spoken, a lonely existence filled with regret. He admitted to the mistakes he had made, the words left unsaid, and the pride he had let consume him during their final argument. "I was wrong to push you away," he wrote. "I thought I was protecting you, but I see now I was only protecting myself, from shame, from the fear of being vulnerable. You deserved better than that." Tears welled in Sophia's eyes as she read each line. Memories of their last confrontation played vividly in her mind, the shouting, the pain, the silence that followed. Yet, here in her hands was something she had never expected, an acknowledgement of her pain and a plea for forgiveness. The letter wasn't just an apology, it was a love letter from a father to his daughter, laced with stories she had never heard before. He shared moments from her childhood that she had forgotten, how proud he was when she first learned to ride a bike, the joy he felt seeing her art displayed in the school gallery. "I have carried these memories with me like treasures," he wrote. "They kept me going when I felt lost, and now I want to create new ones with you, if you'll let me." What struck Sophia most was the vulnerability in his words. Her father, who had always seemed so stoic and unreachable, was laying bare his soul. He admitted his fear of rejection and how it had paralyzed him for years, preventing him from reaching out sooner. The letter ended with a simple but powerful request. "I hope you can find it in your heart to meet me, to let us start again. No matter your decision, please know that I love you, and I always will." Sophia sat back, the letter trembling in her hands. She hadn't realized how tightly she had been holding on to her resentment until now. The words before her cracked something open. A realization that forgiveness wasn't just about the other person, it was about setting herself free too. The letter wasn't just an apology. It was a bridge her father had built, hoping she would choose to cross it. And as the tears streamed down her face, Sophia felt the first stirrings of hope, the first signs of a new chapter waiting to be written. Sophia sat in her quiet apartment, the letter resting on the table before her, like an unwelcome guest. She had read it countless times over the past week, each word simultaneously pulling her closer to and pushing her farther away from a decision she wasn't ready to make. Her emotions were a tangled web of anger, sadness, and longing. The anger stemmed from years of silence, years in which her father had let the rift between them grow wider, leaving her to navigate the pain of abandonment alone. She thought of the holidays spent without him, the milestones he had missed, and the moments when she had needed a father's comfort but found only a void. But then there was the sadness. The letter had awakened memories she had buried, memories of a man who had once been her hero. She thought of the nights he stayed up helping her with her science projects, the laughter they shared over his terrible jokes, and the warmth of his hugs when the world felt too big. How could the same person who gave her such cherished moments also be the one who caused so much pain? Sophia found herself pacing the room, her thoughts a storm she couldn't calm. She replayed their last argument in her head. The shouting, the sharp words that had cut so deep, and the slamming door that had marked the beginning of their estrangement. Was it fair to reopen that wound? Yet the letter had planted a seed of doubt in her anger. His words were sincere, raw, and vulnerable in a way she had never seen from him before. She had always thought of her father as unyielding, but here he was, admitting his mistakes, baring his soul, and asking for forgiveness. The question gnawed at her. Could she forgive him? Forgiveness wasn't simple. It wasn't a switch she could flip. It required revisiting the pain, acknowledging it, and choosing to let it go. But could she trust him? What if opening that door led to more heartache? Sophia sighed and sank into the couch, her head in her hands. Her friends had offered advice, some urging her to give him a chance, others cautioning her to protect her heart. But this wasn't about anyone else. It was her decision, and it felt impossibly heavy. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of the hurt and the love she still carried for her father. The two emotions coexisted, pulling her in opposite directions. She realized that no matter what she chose, it wouldn't erase the past, but perhaps it could redefine their future. As she stared at the letter one more time, Sophia knew that the hardest part wasn't forgiving him. The hardest part was deciding whether to open her heart and take that first step toward reconciliation, or to keep the door closed forever. You said. The air was crisp and cool as Sophia stepped out of her apartment, clutching the letter tightly in her hand. Her heart raced with every step she took toward the small cafe where she had agreed to meet her father. It was the place he had suggested in the letter, a neutral spot that neither of them had memories of, free of the weight of their shared past. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions, fear, anticipation, and a sliver of hope she didn't want to admit was there. She had spent days agonizing over this moment, replaying scenarios in her head. What would she say? What if he didn't show up? Or worse, what if he did, and nothing had changed? As she approached the cafe, she paused outside, her reflection staring back at her in the window. She barely recognized the woman she saw, nervous, vulnerable, and yet determined. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the door, the chime above signaling her arrival. The cafe was warm and inviting, with soft golden lighting and the hum of quiet conversations filling the air. She scanned the room and saw him sitting at a corner table. Her father. His shoulders were hunched slightly, and he looked older than she remembered, the lines on his face deeper, his hair grayer. He was nervously fidgeting with a coffee cup, glancing at the door every few seconds. Sophia hesitated, her feet rooted to the spot. This was the moment she had dreaded and longed for all at once. He hadn't noticed her yet, and for a fleeting second she considered turning around and leaving. But then, as if sensing her presence, he looked up and met her gaze. His eyes widened in recognition, and a mixture of emotions crossed his face: relief, hope, and a touch of apprehension. He stood up slowly, his hands trembling slightly as he gestured for her to join him. Sophia forced herself to move forward, each step feeling heavier than the last. When she reached the table, they exchanged an awkward smile, and he pulled out a chair for her. She sat down, her hands clutching the letter in her lap like a lifeline. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence thick with unspoken words. Finally, her father broke it. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice soft and earnest. Sophia nodded, her throat tight. "I wasn't sure I would." He looked down at his coffee cup, his fingers tracing the rim. "I wasn't sure you would either, but I hoped." They began to talk, their words halting at first, like strangers trying to find common ground. He started with an apology, the same one he had written in the letter, but hearing it in his voice made it feel different, real, vulnerable. As he spoke, Sophia found herself softening, her defenses lowering inch by inch. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't perfect, but it was a start. She realized that taking the step wasn't about erasing the past. It was about building a bridge to something new, something that could only exist if they were both willing to try. By the time they left the cafe, the sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the street. For the first time in years, Sophia felt a spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other. And it had all started with one brave step. Sitting in her small living room, Sophia stared at her father across the coffee table. The silence was palpable, filled with the weight of everything unsaid over the years. The letter lay open between them, its carefully written words now etched into both their hearts. Her father's hands rested nervously on his knees, his gaze fixed on her, waiting for her to speak. Forgiveness. It was such a simple word, yet it carried so much complexity. Could she really let go of the pain, the resentment, and the anger she had held onto for so long? Her father's mistakes had shaped her life in profound ways, ways she was still coming to terms with. And yet, here he was, raw and vulnerable, asking for something she wasn't sure she could give. Sophia closed her eyes for a moment, letting the memories come. She thought of the years she had spent wondering why he had left, of the nights she had cried herself to sleep, and of the walls she had built around her heart to protect herself from ever feeling that kind of pain again. But she also thought of the letter, of the way his words had opened a crack in her armor, letting in just enough light to make her consider the possibility of forgiveness. When she opened her eyes, her father was still watching her, his expression a mixture of hope and regret. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said softly. "I just needed you to know how sorry I am for everything." His words hung in the air, and Sophia felt a lump rise in her throat. She took a deep breath, her hands gripping the edges of the chair as she began to speak. "I don't know if I can forgive you fully," she admitted, her voice trembling, "but I think I can try. Not for you, but for me. Carrying this anger, it's been like carrying a weight I can't put down. And maybe it's time to let go." Her father's eyes filled with tears, and he nodded, his voice breaking as he replied, "That's more than I could ever hope for. Thank you." In that moment, Sophia felt something shift inside her. Forgiveness didn't mean forgetting, and it didn't mean erasing the past, but it did mean allowing herself the freedom to move forward, to heal, and to create space for something new in her life. They sat together in silence for a while, the tension slowly melting away. It wasn't a perfect resolution. There was still work to be done, conversations to be had, and trust to be rebuilt. But it was a beginning. As Sophia looked at her father, she realized that forgiveness wasn't just an act of kindness for him, it was an act of self-compassion for herself. It was a choice to no longer let the past define her future. And in making that choice, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. Sophia sat by the window, the soft glow of the evening sun casting a warm light over her face. The letter that had once brought so much turmoil now rested neatly folded in a frame on the mantelpiece, a symbol not of pain but of healing. She glanced at it briefly, a small smile tugging at her lips. Forgiveness had not been an easy road. It had taken courage, vulnerability, and a willingness to confront the wounds of the past. But in doing so, Sophia had found something she hadn't expected: freedom. Letting go of the anger and resentment had lightened a burden she had carried for far too long. It allowed her to see her father not just for his mistakes, but for the man he was trying to become, a man who was learning, just as she was, to rebuild what had been broken. Her relationship with her father was far from perfect, but it was real. They were taking steps together, one conversation at a time, toward something new. And in those moments, Sophia realized the power of forgiveness. It didn't change the past, but it had the power to transform the future. As she reflected on the journey, Sophia felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, not for the pain she had endured, but for the lessons it had taught her. She had discovered the strength within herself to face her deepest fears and the compassion to extend grace to someone who had hurt her. Looking out at the horizon, she felt a quiet sense of peace. The act of forgiveness had not only changed her relationship with her father, it had changed her relationship with herself. She was no longer defined by the weight of her past, but empowered by the possibilities of her future. Sophia picked up her journal and began to write, her words flowing freely as she captured the essence of her journey. In her heart, she knew that while the letter had been the catalyst, the real change had come from within. And that was a lesson she would carry with her always. Forgiveness, though difficult, was a gift that had transformed her life forever.